program. And this lecture is to honor one of ours, Dr. Tony Jurich. The Tony Jurich Lecture on Social Justice honors Dr. Tony Jurich, a professor in the College of Human Ecology at Kansas State University. He began his career at K-State in 1972 in the Marriage and Family Therapy program, where he taught for more than 39 years before his death in 2010. Tony was loved and respected as a dedicated therapist, an enthusiastic teacher and researcher, and a wise supervisor and mentor. He earned national recognition for his work as a leader in the field of family therapy. Tony's life and work embodied the core principles of social justice, and he challenged his students and colleagues to do the same. Tony's core leadership tenets: strive for resonance, assume value and be respectful, be compassionate, do what is right, seek out, affirm, and utilize diversity, and lead by example, provide a roadmap for sustainable community change. In 2014, Tony's wife, Olivia Collins, and his brother, Steve, established the Tony Jurich Community Commitment and Leadership Student Awards, which recognize graduating students who demonstrate a commitment to these leadership tenets. At this time, I would also like to introduce Olivia. Olivia Collins, would you please stand? And she has helped with today. This lecture is presented by the Marriage and Family Therapy program. Our program director, Dr. Sandy Stith, is with us also today. In the School of Family Studies and Human Services, and I believe Dr. Durband is here as well, if she could stand and raise her hand. And the College of Human Ecology, and our Dean, John Buckwalter, is also in attendance today. Thank you all for being present. And now I would like to introduce our speaker. Dorthy Stuckey Halley is the director of the Victim Services Division of the Office of Attorney General Derek Schmidt, and an expert on domestic violence, dynamics, and batterers. Halley's development of a motivation typology for those who batter has opened the door to a new understanding for judges, prosecutors, law enforcement officers, advocates, and others working in the domestic violence field. She has led the state efforts to develop standards, certify batterer intervention programs, and apply evidence-based practice in this field. Halley started providing services to victims in 1986 and served as director of Safe House, Inc. for more than a decade. During this time, she developed a model rural batterer intervention program in the early 90s, which she continued to operate while teaching social work at Pittsburgh State University for another decade, prior to accepting her current position. In addition to her work on domestic violence, she organized the development of the Attorney General's Human Trafficking Advisory Board in Kansas and served as the first coordinator. She continues to serve on this board and chairs the Victim Services Subcommittee. For her latest publication, she co-authored the chapter Providing Effective Services to Victims of Human Trafficking, Theoretical, Practical, and Ethical Considerations in the book Human Trafficking, A Multidisciplinary Approach, 2014. She has served as president of the Kansas Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence, the Kansas Organization for Victim Assistance, and the Kansas chapter of the National Association of Social Workers. She received the Outstanding Victim Advocate of the Year Award in 1996 and has provided more than 1,000 presentations on a national, state, and local level to more than 20,000 people on batterer intervention, domestic violence, human trafficking, and other topics regarding victimization. She is an author and provides expert witnesses testimony in domestic violence cases. And it's my pleasure to introduce Dorthy Stuckey Halley. Thank you.
Just when they asked for the bio, just said, I'm old. I've been doing this for a long time. I'm humbled to be here today, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you about some of my life's work. I also have to say you have a wonderful crew here who has been meeting my every need. I just got back from New York City yesterday, where I presented on Tuesday to the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women. And I can tell you, if I would not have had an extension cord in with my projector and everything, I wouldn't have been able to show everything because there wasn't an extension cord there. So it's really nice to be here and have all of the assistance from the professionals here, because IT is not my cup of tea, that's for sure. I want to talk to you today about different motives of those who batter, and I can tell you that was not when I got my degrees, what I was thinking I wanted to do with my life's work. In fact, it was almost the furthest thing from that. I was very interested in working with victims. I didn't have any interest in working with those who batter. In fact, I thought it would be great to just lock them up and throw away the key. But that's not the way the system works. And I found myself, I started as the executive director of Safe House in '86. By '92, I had worked with 7 victims of the same perpetrator. And I realized I didn't want to just work with the 8th, 9th, 10th, 14th, 20th. And so, in addition to providing the shelter services, which are critical, needed services, I wanted to do something more than that. So I wanted to start exploring how could we stop the violence. And I knew in order to do that, I would need to turn my efforts into actually trying to understand the perpetrator rather than just denounce them. It actually didn't take me long in working as an advocate to realize that there were some differences among those who batter, because the victims were telling me about different experiences that they had. In particular, there was one group who really described a situation where their partner believed they had the right to be violent when she didn't do what he said, or when he was in a bad mood, or when his day wasn't going well, but particularly if she didn't do what he believed that she needed to do to make his life easier. Relationship very similar to what Lenora Walker talked about in the 70s, where there was an increase in frequency and severity as time went by, but there was an explosive phase followed by a honeymoon phase. And these victims, unlike the others, these victims said, you know, Dorothy, it's different than what Susie describes. When John says he's sorry, he really means it. There's some true remorse. There were other victims, however, that in the evening, when all of the victims who were staying in shelter were sitting around the kitchen table, kids are in bed, and they start disclosing more to each other. And somebody would start talking about some really horrific things, and that her husband enjoyed doing it. And the torture and the sadistic acts that she would be describing, you could tell on the face of the other victims that they had never experienced anything like that. So it really was through the victims that I started understanding that there are some batterers who have some differences from others. We don't have to go very far to really understand that, though, right? All of you have probably taken some, at least introductory information about Albert Bandura and social learning theory. He told us in the 70s that people aggress for different reasons. They aren't all aggressing for the same reason. I came to believe that there are some batterers who have different motives, and those different motives create different actions, different behaviors, and different dangers for them and for their victim and for family members. Now, I think that one of the things that happened was in the last 20 years, we have talked a lot about the entitled batterer. We have talked about the power and control wheel. And we have had that presumption that they all fit in that because we know that pretty well all batterers choose to dominate and control. What we didn't do, however, was take the next step and start looking at, well, why does this batterer with this victim want to dominate and control? What is their motive? And when we take that next step, we find that some of those motives are quite different. So what we're going to do in short order is talk about 3 basic core motives: the entitlement-based, the survival-based, and the sadistic-based, and several subtypes. So when we're looking at the entitlement-based batterer, their motive is based on privilege. And they believe that if things aren't done the way they want them done, then they have a right to punish. Their behavior is often quite calculated. Dr. Neil Jacobson and John Gottman have done quite a bit of work looking at how calculated some of them could be. If you haven't read their work, I would encourage you to read their work. They even wired them up to show the pulse, their heart rate, and when it looked like they were getting really angry, actually their blood pressure was going down. They even thought that the machine was broken, so they tried it again and realized no. Well, it was going down because they were getting what they wanted. They know so well how to manipulate those around them and control them. Now, the whole idea of the entitlement-based batterer fits very well with a crossover between feminist-based theory and social learning theory. And I'm sure probably most of you, how many of you have seen this before? Most of you? Yeah. This is the power and control wheel, and it shows the different things, the different tactics used. And this clearly is something that victims of the entitlement-based batterer can resonate with. The majority of victims can resonate to some extent with this. Ellen Pence up in Duluth and several others worked together to listen to victims and figure out what were those core things that were being used to control them. So it's used a lot. I want to show you now just a little clip of some men who have battered. And we won't show the whole clip, but just for you to get an example of what some who have battered say about their thinking. These men have completed the Family Peace Initiative program, and many of them completed like 4 or 5 years ago, and have stayed in contact one way or another and were willing to take that courageous step about talking about their abusiveness.
I've always thought that one why people didn't just understand that I know what's best for them, and that they should just listen to me, and that, I have an answer to everything besides world peace. You just listen to everything makes sense to me, and I get angry when I figure out when you don't understand why I understand what I understand. It's because I've tried these methods, and it makes perfectly good sense, so you should just do what I actually do.
I felt like my girlfriend knew that I was married to my ex-wife at the time, and knew the situation, and I'll let this go when I decide to, in the meantime I want to hear about it, and we kind of carried on that relationship in a crazy type of way to where I had that, but then I'll go out and cheat with others. And I did that. I always had my ex-wife while I was with my girlfriend for 8 years. So
for me to decide a relationship was over with, I had to already got another relationship and have me somebody. But long as I don't have anybody yet, then you should either. That's just the way I approach things. And again, sometimes I was still I wouldn't at that point, I wouldn't harass you as much because I'm preoccupied. But if all I have is time to sit around wondering what you're doing, then there's going to be some harassment taking place.
It's almost as if I waited to get married to become an asshole, and I've questioned myself about that over the years, because there were things that she would do prior to being married that would upset me, that I would want to physically harm her, and I wouldn't. And it was like, after that marriage license was signed, I felt this sense of, I'm now entitled to treat her this way, because I'm the husband, I'm the man, and what I say goes.
I always,
So that gives you just a flavor of the entitlement-based batter. Now, what David Adams, who wrote Why They Kill, talks about is what I put as a subtype to the entitlement-based batter. He talks about the materially motivated batter, and materially motivated batter type 1 and type 2. Their primary interest is not the relationship itself and the connection. In fact, they could really care less about that. They are interested in what they can get out of having this relationship, primarily money, material assets, etc. This group does not even have the normal level of jealousy. Some are extremely exploitive of women, and they expect really their victim to do it all. You know that old song about I can bring home the bacon, fry it up in the pan? They expect all of that plus a whole lot more. He also talks, though, about the materially motivated batterer, type 2. And this one is the materially motivated, but kind of on steroids, where they actually have contempt for their partner. They view their partner and women as a whole, they see women as interchangeable, and they view them as restrictors of their liberty. Furthermore, some of them, a core group of them, are involved in criminal activity as well. So some of them belong to gangs or have a core group of people that they run with that do some pretty horrific crimes. They do not have a high stake in conformity. So when David Adams describes this, in his book, Why They Kill, he covers 37 different cases, 31 which ended up being lethal, and then 6 that were near lethal. And in 2 of the cases, the victim is involved in prostitution. In neither case was she involved in prostitution prior to getting involved in this relationship, but he forced her to be involved in prostitution. That really made me want to look at what is happening in Kansas. The chart here shows the number of victim service agencies that we provide grants to that reported back working with human trafficking victims in the past since 2009. So 2009, 2 agencies said, yes, we worked with a victim of human trafficking, 1 in Wichita and 1 in Kansas City, the same in 2010. The following year, however, actually in 2010, we started providing some training about human trafficking. And the following year, there were 27 victims served. The next year, 44. The next year, 217. And finally, in fiscal year 2014, there were 352 victims of human trafficking served. Interestingly, I have a few demographics up here, but what I want you to be aware of today is that of those 352, where they could determine the connection between the trafficker and the victim, in over 33% of the time, the trafficker was her spouse or partner. So what we know is that there is an overlap between human trafficking and domestic violence, particularly sex trafficking and domestic violence. And that once we become more aware of what we're looking at, we can start noticing more and more human trafficking cases. I don't think, even though human trafficking, they say, is on the rise, I doubt that it went from 2 to 352 in a matter of 5 years. I think what we have is a circumstance which is much different than when I was running a domestic violence shelter for a decade. During that whole decade, I could count on one hand how many times I knew I was working with someone who, and at that time I would not have said was sex trafficked, I would have said was involved in forced prostitution, okay? 5, when I think back now, I know I worked with probably more than that every month for 10 years. Look at how many I missed because I didn't really understand that connection and I really didn't understand how to identify them. When we know that we're working with a materially motivated batterer or we're working with a victim whose batterer is materially motivated, we need to be thinking about, is this person actually being sex trafficked as well? The next group I want to talk about is survival-based. I don't know how many of you are in a partnership, but if you are in a partnership, I want you to think about if you were to leave tonight and go home and your partner were to say to you that they wanted out of the relationship. What are some of the feelings that might bring up for you or for someone else who is faced with that circumstance? What would anyone feel? Sad. Thank you. What else? Afraid. Yes.
Betrayal.
Betrayal. And when we feel betrayed, what does that bring up? Anger, right. So what we know is, I don't care how emotionally healthy you are, those are some pretty common reactions to an unexpected separation. With a survival-based batterer, they believe that in order for them to really be okay in this old world, they need this person with them. And that's the deal. I married you, or I moved in with you, and you are to be here. And so when they feel that tug of separation, they don't feel fear and anger. Those are pretty normal emotions we all have. They feel terror and rage because it's that primal survival terror and rage. So if we are working with a domestic violence victim who is experiencing that type of circumstance, and if we believe that we ought to be able to rationally discuss this with her and her partner, we are barking up the wrong tree. That's true whether we're law enforcement and we go out on that call, or if we are assisting the victim or seeing them in therapy, etc. What we know is that in these cases, the victims tend to really understand that cycle of abuse that Lenora Walker talked about years ago. They do experience that true remorse during the apology phase. It also fits very well with much of Donald Dutton's abusive personality information. So there's a strong connection, and here's just one example of that cycle of abuse. What we know is that these batterers tend to have borderline tendencies, but not necessarily the disorder. Kaplan, in object relations theory, talks about a person who is incapable of holding a partner's weaknesses and strengths together. They have to be one or the other. They have to be either up here, you're an angel, or you're the scum of the earth. And that's what these victims experience. I often am reminded of what Margaret Mahler and John Bowlby talk about with regard to ego attachment, because there is this description of this child who, when mom walks out of the room, is just very unhappy. But when mom walks back in the room, they start really amping their frustration and reaching, and they're just dissatisfied till mom comes over there and reaches her hands out to take them from the caretaker, whoever's holding them. And there is a core group of kids that arch their back, turn their head, and don't want to have anything to do with mom at that point, right? It's like these survival-based batterers are those kids who never got those issues resolved, that still cannot deal with closeness or separation. So they end up projecting that into virtually all of their intimate relationships, and they have a very strong obsession about their victim. Dutton, in his work regarding the cyclical or emotionally volatile batterer, describes the 5 biggest childhood contributors to wife assault as being shamed by their father as being number 1. Isn't that interesting? Because I think most of the time people think that what's number 3 would be number 1, or what's number 5 would be number 1. So it's interesting that being shamed or feeling rejected and abandoned are number 1 and 2. But I can tell you, after years of running a batterers intervention program, in the group, you see those 2 factors so often come to play. One of the things, how many of you have heard of the ACE studies and adverse childhood experiences? Some of you have. Well, Kaiser Permanente did a study of, I think, over 15,000 people, along with the Center for Disease Control, really explored with 10 pretty horrific childhood experiences. What are the differences that we see about people who have had those experiences versus those who haven't? One of the things that showed up was that life expectancy goes way down if you have 4 or 5 of those 10. And the 10 are like sexual abuse, domestic violence, physical abuse, a parent in prison, drug and alcohol problems in the home, those sorts of things. Well, in addition to having a shorter lifespan and more diabetes and heart trouble and all of those things, we also see that the risk of perpetrating domestic violence goes up for both men and women, the more of those childhood risk factors that are present. When we look at that within a domestic violence batterers intervention program, I thought it was interesting where 2 of the certified batterers intervention programs across the state explored that and started asking those who are in attendance in their program how many factors they had. As you can see with the Center for Disease Control men, where they were asking basically the general population, you've got 60% or so having 1 or less factors. 60% having 1 or less. When it came to the Family Peace Initiative and Hope Harbor folks, there weren't very many that had 1 or less factors. And we know that people tend to minimize these. On the other hand, when it came to 4 or more factors, the majority from the CDC control group didn't have that. But look at how many from the FPI and the Hope Harbor programs were dealing with that. David Adams talks somewhat about that level of desperation in several of the cases that ended up lethal. And it just reminded me so much of what we know about survival-based batterers and some of their childhood challenges and their reactivity to that. In one of the cases, he says the combination of anger toward her and self-loathing, he said he frequently felt inferior. That's what we see with the survival-based batterers. He also says suicide threats, quitting his job, cashing out his retirement, someone who had decided he had little to live for. When we see those things going on, that is a very dangerous situation, and I don't care if they have never had a domestic violence arrest in their lifetime. When you see those kinds of things going on in this kind of mixture, that's a very dangerous situation. It's my belief that it is the survival-based batterer that always surprises the public. You can go to Google and almost any day of the week find some place in the world, in fact, some place in the United States, where there will be neighbors saying, John, I never thought John would do anything like that. Not John. When I had a bum leg, he came over here and mowed my grass without me even asking. So there's survival-based tend to be seen as fine, upstanding, quiet folks. And what often happens is we don't see what's boiling underneath. I want to give you one example here, but I want to forewarn you that this is a little bit graphic.
29-year-old Paul Gonzalez is hoping to get a break when he is sentenced for beating his wife. Beating her inside a judge's chambers last April during a divorce proceeding.
I woke up and I knew where I was. I didn't know what was going on. I was asking about my children and I didn't know what was going on. I just been getting too hard.
Now Catherine Scott sits in court and watches as a defense psychologist insists her ex is and was mentally ill and cannot get the treatment he needs if he goes to prison.
He doesn't just have bipolar disorder. He has bipolar disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and borderline personality disorder. So we've got 3 major disorders co-occurring at the same time within one person.
Yeah, I beg of you, in everything that I have, that you would give me my brother.
Family members pleaded on his behalf, but his ex-wife told the judge the abuse went on for years, physical and mental, and the divorce had brought out the worst of it.
He asked me that he's going to take the children and I would never see them again. And that it was his plan to make my life really fun.
But I can't deny that it was me able to took these 2 men and put them on my former wife. And I know she said that she wouldn't accept any apology. But what can I say other than I'm sorry?
Despite those pleas, the psychologist and the apology, the judge would not even reduce what was the state's guideline, 4 years and 3 months in a state prison. Not only did he not go lower than that, he went all the way to the maximum sentence of 15 years. In Fort Lauderdale, Derek Hayward, 7 years.
And did you all hear where that happened? In the judge's chamber, right? In the judge's chamber, he attacks her like that. Do you think that was a well thought out plan from? No. It is an act of desperation. It's an act where he doesn't even care, isn't even thinking about what's going to happen to him regarding that. He is in that terror and that rage. And that's one of the things we need to remember about the survival-based, is that this is not something that we can rationally discuss with them once they get to that point. And yet, I have yet to see a survival-based batterer who wanted to be there. They don't want to do this, but at some point, when that desperation kicks in and they believe, it's like their whole world flips around. Do you think a protection order would have been very much assistance to his wife? Absolutely not. No, because he did not care what happened to him. On the other hand, with the entitlement-based batterer who has a high stake in conformity, a protection order can just mean the world in helping protect that victim and keeping her batterer away. So we really have to look at these things when we're looking at risk and safety planning. Going to show you now a video about the survival-based, similar to the entitlement-based. You have, I hope you all have a couple of sheets of paper, and on one of them it lists the motive lens, and I think if you turn to the survival-based section, you'll be able to hear the men talk about some things that relate to that.
Feelings that I had never had before. It was a very scary time, and I didn't want those feelings to end. You know, I was actually, it was really scary, but at the same time, it was the best I ever felt in my life. Trying to be close to somebody. After, you know, everything, you know, my dad abusing me, my grandfather abusing me, mom and brother raising me. My mom pretty much had disowned me. It's really hard to get close to anybody. I mean, when you get betrayed at times, it's really hard.
So he called me from the gas station, and he's screaming and yelling, and he's screaming so hard that he has to stop and pant and catch his breath. And he's saying to me, you're a whore, and your daughter's going to be a whore, and I should kill you before you embarrass me. And I should kill your daughter before she grows up and she embarrasses me too. And this is his daughter. And he said, if we're not together, you can date whoever you want to. But if I kill you, you belong to me. And I'll go to prison and spend every day of the rest of my life knowing that I own you. Because I took your life.
Chrissy went out with her girlfriends and to the bar. And when she got home, you know, I automatically started treating her good things. And finally, I asked her if she wanted me to just slap her or something, you know, because she was lying to me. And, you know, I felt that she was lying to me and lying to me. And so I was just like, well, do you want me to slap you and make you, you know, tell me or something like that? And finally I did. I slapped her across the face and left. But before I left, I ran her car with my truck, and I ran her car down to where my truck actually climbed over the top of her car. One session.
So the survival base, for the most part, does not connect closely with human trafficking. However, they do have a Jekyll and Hyde personality, and when they are angry and wanting to lash out, when I have seen a connection at all, it has been that they became a buyer rather than that they were a trafficker. The sadistic-based motive is the third one I want to talk about. The sadistic batterer is motivated by the pleasure they receive by causing another person pain. I have found them to be the most intelligent, and they usually have considerable power on the job. These are often doctors, lawyers, CEOs. head of a university. I'm just trying to think of some of them that I've worked with. What we see with them is that they have a tendency to spend a lot of time convincing everyone what a great person they are. Oftentimes connecting very closely with the victim's mother and father, and then they subtly, very subtly, start doing things to make everyone start questioning the victim's sanity, including the victim themselves. But I've seen them do things like follow their victim to the grocery store, and then when she goes into the grocery store, taking their key and going and moving the car from where it was parked clear around to the other side. It's those kinds of things. It's sadistic manipulations. Well, if she starts saying something to her family and friends about, gosh, I never can find my car anymore. It's always not where I've left it. People start wondering about her, right? We've had batterers who have put tape recorders all around the house with taping conversations and playing them very low. And then when the victim says, do you hear that? Where's that coming from? It's like, no, dear, I'm really getting somewhat concerned about you, though, because you've been doing this a lot lately where you're hearing voices that aren't there. So when somebody presents themselves as hearing voices that aren't there, they are often seen as the one with the problem, right? So what happens is the victims of the sadistic batterer are often seen as mentally ill. They are often very isolated from family and friends, and they have gone downhill considerably. The first place that I noticed a lot of them was when the psychiatrist at 5th floor Mount Carmel years ago would ask me to come and assist some victim who was staying at the psych ward. The earliest one that I think we should be thinking about in regard to sadistic batterer was Hedda Nussbaum, in the Hedda Nussbaum Joel Steinberg case, where Joel Steinberg was an up-and-coming attorney in New York City. Hedda Nussbaum was an elementary school teacher and then did the publisher of children's books. They got together. Unbeknownst to her, he illegally adopted several children, and he became very sadistic in his interactions with both her and the children, ultimately killing Lisa, the older daughter. The reason this ended up on the front page of Newsweek, however, was because Hedda did nothing to come to the aid after Joel left to go see a client. Hedda didn't call the police or get any kind of assistance for Lisa. That was because Hedda was so mentally ill by that point that she could not help herself or them. Although she was originally arrested for second degree, they ended up dropping the charges against her. They say that the wounds she had from torture were so severe that she would have died in another week had there not been an intervention made. Here is an example of a sadistic batterer. Now, as you can imagine, we didn't have a lot of sadistic-based folks who were signing up saying, hey, you can interview me. However, this speaks somewhat to the complexity of things, because I think that in this video, what you hear from a batterer who is basically entitlement-based is the sadistic batterer that was happening in his childhood.
Before I went to live with my grandmother, I lived with my mom and dad. We all lived together, and it was kind of a domestic violence situation, but my mother was the perpetrator of the domestic violence, and my dad would always be the more passive type, and to this day. And I remember one particular instance when I was about 5 years old, my mother had purchased a gun, and I knew it, but I didn't know whether she was going to try to use it against him or anything like that, but I was concerned. So I let him know that she had got that gun, he was able to get it out of the home, get rid of it. So I don't know if I actually saved him from being shot or anything like that, but it was definitely a concern of mine at that time. One particular incident I remember for sure is that I remember my mom boiling some syrup on the stove and putting a roll of some pennies in it and throwing it on while you were in the shower. So the copper pennies would stick to you, so we still have these little Abraham Lincoln heads burning on.
There clearly is a connection between the sadistic batterer and human trafficking. Many victims of sex trafficking talk about being tortured. And often the sadistic batterer might start actually doing some sadistic acts to a victim of sex trafficking prior to gaining enough security to feel that he can actually perform that on his partner. An example of how these two sometimes get intertwined happened in Lebanon, Missouri, where a 16-year-old female adopted, having trouble with her parents, and she started dating Ed Bagley's son. In 2002, she ran away from home and she moved in with the Bagleys. Shortly thereafter, the involvement switched from Ed Bagley Jr. to her involvement with Ed Bagley Sr., and she became his sex slave. The torture was intense.
5 Missouri men are accused of the long-term sexual torture of a mentally challenged woman in Lebanon, Missouri. The U.S. Attorney says the woman was nearly killed by smothering an electric shock. Working for you, we have team coverage on this tonight. First, Fox News' Monica Evans reports from Nevada, Missouri, where the town's postmaster is among the men charged in the federal indictment.
The headlines in the Nevada Daily Mail about the town's postmaster being charged with striking a mentally disturbed woman on a wooden pony, beating her with leather straps, and shocking her with an electrical device sent shockwaves through this town of about 8,000 people.
He certainly never gave any indication professionally that he was engaged in anything like that.
The U.S. Attorney charged 50-year-old Dennis Henry, the postmaster in Nevada, Missouri, 60-year-old Michael Stokes, 43-year-old Edward Bagley, both of Lebanon, 44-year-old James Noel of Springfield, and 31-year-old Bradley Cook of St. Louis with sex trafficking. The indictment says in December of 2002, Edward Bagley invited the 16-year-old to live in his trailer in Lebanon and promised to make her dreams of becoming a model and dancer come true. Instead, investigators say Bagley forced the woman to dance in strip clubs, sexually abused and tortured her, and made her sign a sex slave contract. Court documents also reveal Bagley tattooed the woman's neck with a barcode, put an S on her back to mark her as a sex slave, and put a Chinese symbol of a sex slave on her ankle. The government also alleges some of the victim's sensitive body parts were nailed to a piece of wood, and a private area was sewn shut.
That's crazy. That's nuts. I don't know why anybody would be able to do that.
Investigators say the conspiracy was uncovered when Bagley both suffocated and shocked the woman into cardiac arrest, and she had to be rushed to a hospital.
That's just sad. Who would do that to somebody who doesn't even know what's going on there? It's just horrible.
If the 5 men are convicted of sex trafficking, they can face a minimum mandatory 15 years in prison. In Nevada, Missouri, Monica Evans, Fox 4 News, working for you.
You know, we don't want to believe that those kinds of things go on in our own community, and neither did those communities. In fact, one of the victims, or one of the women who work in a restaurant there said, oh no, you know, they no more held her captive than the man in the moon. She was coming in here. So it's difficult sometimes for us to understand that someone can be trafficked and in hostage and yet act so normal out in the public. It's also difficult for the communities to understand that their postmaster and that people that they think are normal walking around would be involved in this sort of thing. So it's very unsettling. Now that we've talked about the 3 different types, I want you to remember that any one person could be anywhere on those types. But when it comes to the sadistic and the survival-based, those are extremely high risk. And when you look at the materially motivated that have a very low stake in conformity, those too can be very high risk cases for victims. When it comes to application, gaining contextual information can make all the difference in the world in how we should be responding to those who batter as well as to their victims and kids. We need to be thinking about this stuff when it comes to custody issues, when it comes to all kinds of different dynamics that we can get pulled into. In understanding motive, we can better assist the victim, better safety plan with them, help them better understand their risks. And in some cases, what we find is that there's a lot more cooperation with law enforcement once the victim understands more the dynamics that are going on in her experience. Considering motive in working with those who batter has proven to be quite effective. 170 completers of a batterers intervention program in 5.5 years showed that 81% were not known to reoffend when court service officers looked into that, nor did they have protection orders filed against them again over a 5.5-year time frame. When we look at motive and using it in our anti-human trafficking efforts, it opens the door for addressing both domestic violence and human trafficking victim service needs with a greater clarity. It also helps us put the focus back on the person who is perpetrating the violence, rather than asking the age-old question of why does she stay. It also opens the door for us to think about using batterers intervention programs who we know are already working with a lot of sex traffickers and Johns to supplement that work and have them provide some input and perhaps do some development of human trafficking intervention work regarding John schools or working with the buyers as well. I know that the information that I've provided today is not something that is real nice, warm, and fuzzy, but I hope that you will be able to utilize it as you provide services or even with the general public and in our own communities and our own families, kind of understand better what might be going on. Thank you.
Thank you so very, very much. We do have time for a few quick questions, and the mic is there. If anyone has a question that they would like more information about, please feel free to step up to the mic.
Hello.
I just was wondering, what type of survivor-based programs are state-funded in Kansas?
You know, when it comes to programs for those who batter, by far the majority of them are providing the service specifically to what the offender can pay and use a sliding scale. There are a few programs that are involved with another agency, umbrella agency, and I think several of them are getting some funding from the Department of Corrections, but none of the funding is specific to working with survival-based or working with sadistic-based or entitlement-based. It would be for providing batterers intervention programming. there has been discussion about, well, should the structure of the program be totally different because there are these different motives? My sense on that is no, that there are some core things through all of it, and that entitlement-based batterers can learn something by sitting in group and seeing the survival-based batterers struggle. They can learn from each other. So much of what they need to know is very similar. The facilitator of the group needs to be figuring out, by knowing who's in the group, what they need to emphasize with the different people in the group. The other problem with breaking it out is that you also have some that are survival-based, but they also have some strong entitlement issues, or sadistic-based and entitlement. So when you break them out, where would you put those? So it just seems to work better to have them all together. Now, when it comes to working with the victims, we have the same thing. The funding, there is funding, both from the Governor's Grants Office and from the Attorney General's Office for domestic violence shelters and other victim service agencies, and that too is not specific to motive. Anything else? Oh, come on, you can come up with a question. You know what happens in class when you don't start asking questions, then the teacher starts asking you? Still can't prompt it, huh? Well, thank you for being here today.